All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started for now. Um, Leah, if you could. Oh, we've got the slide changed. Cool. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you all are. I am Rebecca Fall, Program Manager for the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And this is a naughty cat who screams at me unless I hold her like a baby. I am thrilled to welcome you all to today's installment of Race and Dialogue, a conversation series from our center that features discussions across professional generations between scholars of pre-modern critical race studies and critical Indigenous studies. We are absolutely honored to have today to have the matriarch of PCRS with us, Professor Emerita Margo Hendricks, who also writes some pretty hot romance under the pen name Elizabeth Grace, in conversation with our very own Dr. Yasmine Hachimi, public humanities postdoc at the Newberry Library. We're also happy to report from Chicago for our California folks that it's the first day that we've had snow stick of the season. So sorry about that, Yasmine. Before we dig into what promises to be a great conversation about race and representation in romance, I will briefly read the Newberry's land acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry has crafted this acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Thakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. Since this is a virtual event, our panelists and audience members are joining us from many places. Wherever you currently are, we encourage you to learn about how you may be of service to the people on whose lands you are situated and seek to understand your place within the history that has brought you to reside there. So with that said, I will turn it over to Drs. Hachimi and Hendricks. Thank you both for being here, and take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, for that lovely introduction. I'm so excited to be here with you all today and to be in conversation with the fabulous Dr. Margo Hendricks. Today, we will be discussing all things race, representation, and romance. And while this discussion will touch on important conversations that are circulating within academia, it is at its heart about romance novels. So don't be surprised if we start fangirling about a particular author, novel, scene, or character. That's to be expected. So, Dr. Hendricks. You are Professor Emerita.
Wait. I want you to do that. I want you to do that one again. That was brilliant. I loved it. Okay.
So, Dr. Hendricks, you are Professor Emerita in Shakespeare and early modern literature and culture, and you're a romance writer. When did you first start reading romance novels, and how did your career as a romance writer begin?
That's going to force me to date myself. And so I first started reading romance novels when I was working in the post office in Oakland, California. My pathway to the academy, of course, was never a straight line. I am not an academic baby, and I've reminded people for years that the reason I thought getting an academic job would be good was so I could write romance novels and plays. I decided I wasn't very good at plays, so I would become romance novels. But I've been a reader for a few decades. I probably wrote my first one, as like many authors, as a kid, in imitation of a historical fiction that I read about the Plantagenets. And actually Elizabeth I, but as a princess. And it sucked, and I don't have a copy of it because, for good reasons. So I started up again when I was in graduate school. And that's when I decided that no matter what, that was always going to be my first love, my first career, and academia is a job to pay for me to be able to write romance.
I love that answer. So I want to talk a bit about your recent publication, Race and Romance, Coloring the Past, which came out in April 2022 from ACMRS Press. So Race and Romance, Coloring the Past traces the literary history of the romance genre back to the Greeks with Heliodorus's Ethiopia, and it explores the translation and circulation of Ethiopia in 16th and 17th century literary adaptations. Can you tell us a little bit about the way early modern writers and early modern people in general were thinking about racial difference and interracial romance?
Wow. Wow. That's a large question. Honestly, I think one of the most pernicious things about race as an ideology, as a systemic and systematic institution, is its appearance of simplicity and its appearance of infallibility and of being extraordinarily malleable. Race can be anything that you want. If you are in a position of power to define it. So one of the things that I think has always been important to me, and I try to explore it in some ways in Race and Romance, is a sense of the necessity to localize a concept of race that could be consistent with emerging capitalism. I think that's the undertone of that book, that what we're seeing with racial discourse and racial definitions and racial representations in the early modern period, in the pre-modern period, honestly, is a movement towards solidifying it. So one of the things that I think that translations of Heliodorus' Ethiopia did was to destabilize the sense of the importance of the unimportance of color to racial thinking. It's class, it's lineage, it's genealogy. If you read Ethiopia, you know that she is the daughter of a king. And even though she's in love with Theogenes, he is technically a descendant, I believe, of, was it Achilles or Aeneas or someone? And so that made him an acceptable match. And if you've read any of the Renaissance and medieval romances, you know that an outsider whose birth is equal to or greater than the insider can be acceptable regardless of color, which is why you have a lot of romances where African peoples end up being the husbands, the wives, the partners of European people in these romances, because color wasn't the issue. It really was about class or economic status, which is why it's so friggin' important to engage in an understanding of the intersection of colorism, and I want to move away a little bit from race, but colorism, class, gender, in quotes, and sexuality. And then you could throw in a fifth marker, which is religious beliefs, as a way of thinking about how race is constructed in it. And I'm going to talk about England because I know it best. With the translations, one of the things that actually drew me in, pushed me away, drew me back, pushed me away, was the way in which Chariclea evolved into Clorinda and became the sacrificial lamb for all of the continent of Africa, all the continent of people associated with Africa, regardless of their color. They became lodged in this Ethiopian body that may have the appearance of being similar to the Europeans or to the Christians, but it fundamentally inside is different, which, jumping forward, of course, makes sense of Isle of the Pines, where everybody's white, but you have to differentiate because you can't have sameness even among whiteness. There has to be gradations. And so I think what I tried to do in that book was to trace a kind of linear mapping in a nonlinear fashion of how colorism becomes part of racecraft in that period, and it continues on into the present. And for me, color passing was the key. I also wrote the first draft 10 years ago because I was fascinated with Afro-Ben as someone who engaged in racial passing. And I wanted to establish that it was a thing in the past. So that's what I did.
One of the things I love so much about Race and Romance, as you said, is a trans-historical project. So you're thinking about colorism in the past and you're thinking about it today. And I was so excited when I first read it to see that you included the works of Beverly Jenkins, who you introduced me to, actually, introduced me to her books, and now I have fallen in love. So in your books, you talk about Forbidden and Indigo, which both have male characters that pass, and they do so in political ways,
Yes.
and intentionally. And so I wanted to ask you, when you first started reading Miss Beverly's books, and how did you begin to make those connections between depictions of colorism in historical romance novels today and in the examples you were working with in your research from the past?
Okay, so Indigo is my fave. I just, when I read Forbidden, I wasn't as crazy about it as I was some of her other books. I loved Night Song. I loved, hold on a second, Topaz. I love these. I loved her earlier works. And Forbidden, for some reason, didn't leap out at me until I was writing an essay on Indigo for Black Love Matters, and decided I couldn't write about Indigo in Race and Romance. So I went back, but I knew that Forbidden dealt with color passing. One of the things that strikes me differently about both books, although their male protagonists engage in the same behavior, is the degree to which one is positioned pre-Civil War and one is positioned post-Civil War. One is grappling with the issues of Reconstruction and the backlash that is about to just weigh down on unenslaved people, formerly enslaved people, if you like. And for Rhine, there's a methodical No, it's deliberate. There's a pragmatic reason. He knows he's passing. Both of the men know they're passing. There is just no way that Ms. Jenkins would allow us to have this as whoops, and there it is kind of moment. There's a deliberateness to what they do. The prologue for Forbidden begins with Ryan passing and him making the decision he's going to continue. But he never loses contact with himself as a Black person. The same with my man Galen.
I knew you couldn't say his name without smiling.
Oh, he's so hot. He never loses sight of himself as someone who is engaged in a deliberate act of resistance that places his life in danger if he's caught. But in an important way, he never leaves the Black community. He returns to it. Ryan leaves the Black community in order to help his people. So
But
that's
they
to me.
know, that's the thing I love, is the Black community knows.
Well, yeah.
He's one of them, you know what I mean? The white people are fooled.
White people see what they want to see. I mean, on some level in that chapter when I talked about, seeing what you want to see. All right. Someone looks at me and says, she's Black. Someone looks at you and says, she's probably Latina. She may be, given her name, she's probably Middle Eastern, or she's white.
They'll just say mixed because they don't know.
Or they don't know, but mixed with what? If they
Right.
actually, so the genealogy is you yourself, scratch back 2 generations, have a Black ancestor, who's to say? So we see what we want to see, especially when it comes to color passing. And Black people have known that for years, that, whiteness is a peculiar facade more so than Blackness. Because honestly, Black people who wear whiteness and we know how to behave white. We know what it means to be a white person in this country, because that has been our existence for nigh on to 400 years, okay? Since the inception of this nation state. So we know more about white people than white people ever know about themselves. We've had to, in order to fight for our liberation, in order to exist, in order to avoid the dangers. And so both men know and understand whiteness so much better than white people believe that they understand Blackness, which is what makes color passing so effective. The other issue about those 2 books, which I find fascinating, and I didn't write about it, but to think about it, is neither of them is the tragic mulatta. Because it's not about escaping their Blackness. Both of them recognize that they cannot escape their Blackness. So what they want to do is benefit their community. And that's one of the things that, for me as a Black romance author, is so important, is to represent that sense of community, that sense of family, that sense of belonging, which is why, so I'm going to rewrite Heliodorus as a romance. All right.
I love that. Add it to the list of things you're writing.
Well, it's up there. Yes, it's going to go up there. Because I actually probably kind of did, maybe sort of, but for Chariclea, she leaves her adoptive family because of love. And she goes through trial and tribulations, and she's effectively restored to her genealogical family, her, if you like, biological parents, and a community. and is accepted and embraced and brought into that. And the person she's chosen as her love interest is also brought into that community. Right? What happens with romance after that and the revisions is that the Characlea figure, and this is a long way to answer your question, the Characlea figure in Clorinda's body is severed from community and must die. We see this in contemporary historical romances increasingly that are sadly interracial, because the separation of it's 99%, Black female or mixed race female from a community that they were born into, a family they were born into, peoples who they were akin to in terms of likeness or whatever. All of that's severed for them to pursue a love interest. And they have to be assimilated into this other community. It is something that I love about both Forbidden and Indigo, is that neither Rhine nor Galen assimilate fully.
Right.
They don't embrace it. They use it. They use their ability to be white to do that. So
yeah, and their social status allows them to do that as well,
absolutely.
right? They have money.
They are
I've been
wealthy.
thinking about what would have happened if they didn't have that money, right? Like what would their options have been? I think about that a little bit.
Yeah.
So you touched on genealogies a little bit. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about romance genealogies and how romance has a lineage and relationship to race.
Okay. Of course, it has a genealogy. It as a genre, as a literary genre, and people who say otherwise can fight me about this, and I will win. As a literary genre, romance has been around forever. And what I like about it is it's that, I don't want to say it's a chameleon. I want to say it's more like a changeling, because it can assume whatever shape the author wants. One of the things that I think that fundamentally occurred in the early modern period, and I've been thinking about this. I'm probably not going to write about it, or I might write about it, who knows, is up until the 17th century, the major authors of romance were male. I mean, we had exceptions, you had Mary Sidney, you had Mary Roth, but up until the end of the 17th century, the majority of romance authors were male. And then there was just this interesting flip having to do with readership. And we don't pay enough attention to how readership can redefine a genre in such a way that it fundamentally changes that genre. So at the time that women are increasingly, and again, I'm talking about England, becoming readers of especially prose fiction, of the prose narratives, and writing it, then suddenly romance becomes unworthy of the masculine form. And so I think the first generation was kind of writing these narratives about positioning gender relations in and again, I'm talking about European and specifically about England, in a kind of Christian dynamism that was distinctly patriarchal, distinctly nationalistic in interesting ways, even when they rewrote them, and distinctly narratives of a kind of an early white supremacy that negated some of the older narratives that were defined in romance, romantic relations were defined in terms of class and lineage. So that by the next iteration, and some people blame it on the rise of the middle class, and I'm not going to get into that argument. But the next iteration is where romance becomes solidly for women and solidly a reflection of middle class values. But those values have only retained a particular Protestant Christian patriarchy and a racial capitalist representation of the superiority of whiteness. So that's the second generation, and there we see the Austins, and then we move into the 20th century and the Hyers, and sadly enough, with contemporary romances, we see them, and I love her, but you know, in the Nora Roberts, I love the books, but let's not pretend that these books do anything towards moving diversity. And, you know, I adore Lisa Kleypas, but let's not pretend that these books move in any direction towards any kind of grappling with racial capitalism. What they grapple with, which I find fascinating, and this is kind of the next, I'm going to say, maybe the third generation of romance. They've grappled with the nexus of gender, sex, and class, leaving intact whiteness and the ideologies of whiteness in those texts. And now we're just starting our fourth generation, when those of us who read and gobbled up and devoured romance novels by primarily white authors, and managed to get our hands through word of mouth of Black romance authors and Latina romance authors. When we could get our hands on, now we're seeing a generation that same way. The intersectionality of racial capital, the intersectionality of postmodern capitalism, and the romance genre needs to be grappled with. I mean, to be honest, underneath all of the stuff that I write, capitalism is always a function. So I think we're in the fourth generation, if I'm going to do that without giving you some actual centuries, because I refuse to do that.
I love that. Okay, I want to segue just a little bit, but not too much, to talk about your latest publication, Elizabethan Mischief, which came out in August 2022. So this is, for those of you who haven't read it, you should. There will be a link in the chat to purchase it. It's a sexy historical romance with lots of intrigue, and it's set towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign. She does appear. So in addition to romantic relationships, which we expect given the genre, this book also explores colorism and cross-cultural contact. So for people who haven't read it, we see colorism specifically through the lens of the twins, one who is Black and one who is white presenting. And then we have our cross-cultural contact with the dashing Mohammed El Nouri, who's the Moroccan ambassador. And then we have Christopher Marlowe, spoiler alert, who is back from the dead and working as a translator and member of El Nouri's entourage. So I just wanted to ask, what inspired you to write this story with these characters?
Honestly, the inspiration was an paranormal romance that I wrote. Fate's Kiss has a shifter who who engages in white passing. And I'm not going to go into that book, but I went, ooh, and she owns a brothel in London, and I'm real big on brothels in the 16th and 17th century. And I really wanted to explore what it might mean to write an atypical situation. One of the things, if you read a lot of early modern medical treatises, as I have, and other odd stories about reproduction and generation, there's a belief that a parent could bring out twins, one looking like the father who was Black and one looking like the mother who was white. And 3 o'clock in the morning, some idea comes to me, and literally I listened to my head at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that book came into existence because of that. Honestly, those weird ideas. I knew I was going to set it in Elizabeth's court. I knew I wanted to write about the Black community in early modern London and by extension, early modern England. I knew I wanted to not have the love interest of either twin a white male. Their mother was married to an aristocratic white male who basically repudiated his father for the woman he loved, which I liked because there was a kind of bringing him into her community rather than her going into his. I'm not going to do any spoilers if you haven't read it. Well, I have to, because the grandfather takes the white presenting daughter and raises her grandchild in the Elizabethan court. She's a lady of waiting, etc. So one of the things that I really had to do was to tackle the question of who knows? You know, who would know? The grandfather knew. Okay. Marlowe knew.
Marlowe knows everything.
Okay, not, you know, I gotta write, he's Marlowe. And the daughters didn't know because of blackmail and extortion. And so by the time they come together, they are adults. And they discover there's no reason for them to disbelieve. And so I'm going to use white and Black presenting because this is the only way to really stop the mess. The Black presenting daughter, granddaughter, is all about vengeance. She's that side of me that says, you know what, I will cut you out of my life, cut you out of my universe. You don't exist anymore, okay? You did this, justice. The white presenting daughter, having grown up in the court, knows about survival. So they come together to basically achieve justice and fall in love on the way. And when I wrote this, before you ask, when I wrote the scene of Al-Nuri checking her out and her checking him out, it was like, I was sitting there going, oh, there are times when I was like,
it was really sexy. I was like flipping the pages, like amazing. Well, and I love that. I love that the Black presenting sister starts to teach the white presenting sister Arabic so that they can gossip and talk about people without anyone understanding, because that's something like my cousin and I do when we go out, when we're together. If we want to start gossiping or talking about people, we just switch to Arabic, Moroccan Arabic, Darija. So I totally identified with that. And it was so, the moment when the white presenting sister gets really angry and sort of says something in Arabic, and Al-Nuri understands her and is like, whoa, wait a minute. I wasn't expecting that from you. And now I'm even more intrigued. I love it. It just like heightened the sexual tension between the characters. It also showed, how these twins are bonding over, their shared identity and community that they didn't both always share.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do want to ask you.
Okay, first, thank you, Yasmine. Because without you, I would have screwed up the Arabic. I just want you to.
You're welcome. It wasn't just me.
I know.
I wasn't the only person translating. But yeah, it was a lot of fun.
But it was through you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's so great. And one of the things too about representation, for those of us who have grown up reading romance, and it's a form of escapism, sure, we don't always see ourselves, even though we're supposed to see ourselves as the heroine, but when she's like always looks a certain kind of way, it's not you. And so it's always wonderful and surprising to come across a book that in any way feels like home, in any way feels like there's some sort of connection to who you are, your culture, your language. Those are the really magical moments. And so that was also one of the reasons why I love this book.
Thank you.
So back to Christopher Marlowe. I have to ask this because in the past you've called yourself a Christopher Marlowe stan.
I am.
What is it about Christopher Marlowe that fascinates you?
Wild boy. He's a wild boy. You know who would be a perfect Christopher Marlowe right now?
Who?
Tom Hiddleston.
You think so?
As Loki playing Christopher Marlowe.
Okay. That's specific. Okay.
That's specific.
I will think about that.
Think about it.
I'll text you about this.
Marlowe is, there were two ways I entered early modern English studies. One was Marlowe, reading Huron Leander. And then I read Tamburlaine and I'm like, yes, this is my man. So on the one hand, he gives me this amazing, love poem that's deeply erotic, that is deeply engaging and so on, that just blows my mind. And then he gives me Tamburlaine. Like I said, okay, so you should know I love Shakespeare's tragedies. I could give a rat's tush about the history plays. I'm not so crazy about the romances. I'm okay with the comedies. I love Midsummer Night's Dream, as you know. But it's the tragedies that I'm like, yes. And Marlowe brought me into that because he gave me this powerful figure based on a non-European who was extraordinarily political, understood what he was about, and did it. It was the first time since I was a kid that I saw a non-European powerhouse. My first one was Salah ad-Din. Okay. And to read this, even though it's written by an Englishman, was a moment for me. And then, and no one in my graduate program honestly taught Titus Andronicus. So I read that on my own. And that's what moved me into Shakespeare, thinking about what these dramatists were doing and how differently they were doing it. And I honestly think that Marlowe's characters are not safe for polite society. And I think that's what drew me because of that. And then he's in this book because I wanted to resurrect him. So I wanted to play on the spy issues. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to play on him turning Turk.
Yes.
Issue. And refusing to unturn Turk, if that makes sense. So
does.
Marlowe remains in Morocco. He will appear in this next book coming briefly, but Marlowe never returns to England. He will die in Morocco, protecting Meg and her
Yeah.
children.
I love that.
Yeah.
I also, Marlowe's one of my favorites as well. And I'm so surprised Marlowe's not taught more than Shakespeare, because I actually think he's more teachable and more interesting. I said it. I feel like, I don't know if this is a safe space because this video is going to go up on YouTube, but Marlowe all the way. I'd much prefer to talk about Marlowe than Shakespeare.
Well, again, I think there's a cultivation. There has been a cultivation of Shakespeare, and I think it's diminished the range of writers during the period who grappled with so many of the issues that early modern England was facing as it basically shot out of the chute towards modern capitalism. I mean, if you look at, a 100-year period and England's transformation, some of these playwrights were grappling with, what does it mean to be England? What does it mean to wield a nation of desperate parts into a whole? So I do think that's there.
Well, I have so many more questions, but I'm looking at the time, and
Okay.
I already see some attendees are asking questions in the chat. So I'm going to sort of wrap things up. So for those of you who don't know, when Margo and I met, we bonded over our mutual appreciation for some of the heroes in Lisa Kleypas's novels, including our favorite wayward anti-hero, Derek Craven. So now comes the moment of truth, our romance hero showdown. We're each going to tell you who our top 5 favorite romance heroes are. And I will let you go first.
You're so wrong. Okay.
Or
Galen?
I could go first and then you could respond back.
Yeah, but I would
whichever
just
one you
argue
want
with
to
you. So let me get it out of the way. I would argue with your choices. Okay. Galen Vachon in Indigo. Derek Craven in Dreaming of You. Cam Rohan in what is it? Mind by Midnight, I believe.
She wants me to give her more options. That's what's happening right now. 5.
St. Vincent.
All
You
right.
know. Lisa
Okay.
Kleypas's Devil in Winter.
I mean, yeah.
St. Vincent.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And then Rhine Fontaine in Forbidden.
I was gonna say.
I told you I'm not going to just stick with 5. So you got.
Okay. All right. My number 1 is Lord Westcliff from It Happened One Autumn by Lisa Kleypas. Number 2, Ryan Fontaine from Forbidden by Beverly Jenkins. I switched mine up last minute because I can do this. Number 3 is going to be St. Vincent from Devil in Winter. I can't resist. I have to put him in there. Number 4, I'm going to go sort of like older and classic, Captain Wentworth from Persuasion by Jane Austen. I'm half agony, half hope. Like, I'm a sucker for love letters. So write that in there.
Okay.
And then my 5th would be Rydstrom from Kiss of a Demon King by Cressley Cole, which is a paranormal romance, but I feel like it works. Derek Craven gets an honorable mention. Honorable mention for Derek Craven.
Come on, when he takes off her glasses.
Her glasses.
Yes. And then when he gives her a new pair. Oh, come on.
I know. And he carries the glasses around in his pocket. Yeah, I know.
Hold on. Let me see if I have it. Hold on. Okay, you can go to questions. I'm not seeing it.
Do you have the little button?
Yes. Derek Craven would, but yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Derek Craven would never.
Yes.
All right, so for our questions, let's see what we've got here. So you mentioned Aphra Ben in relation to the issue of passing. I would love to hear more. Are you
Okay.
referencing the narrator's representation, perhaps an appropriation of Orinoco's voice when retelling the story?
No, I'm saying she's engaged in color passing. Um, uh, okay. And of course, one of the lovely things about the past, you can't prove it. I, number one, don't look at Orinoco as the site for exploring her racial identity per se. I look at her other writings, specifically the romances, and the way in which the certain kind of and it is narration, it is the narrative voice, but the way in which the authorial presence gets interjected into these narratives. The problem with Orinoco for me is one, I don't consider it a romance. Okay. I'm the HEA, okay? Happily ever after girl. Not, I mean, I will tolerate an HFN happily for now, but Orinoco's a love story that ends traumatically. So if you even wanted to stretch the threads of romance, you could say that he and Amoinda end up in that their love, they die together, and so they're happily in the ancestral lands. But that's not on the page, if you remember Orinoco and what happens to him. So I actually have been thinking about the other texts that she writes, specifically the other novels that she writes. So that's what I'm doing. And just so you know, I've been raising this as a question for years. And again, there's no proof. And there's no proof that she is who she says she is, or that people or the biographers claim that she is, because they're all engaged in speculation. And it's one of the things that I love about her. So, yeah.
All right, our next question is, how does the construction of whiteness or fairness in the medieval romance genre affect the Renaissance constructions of race in England? I'm thinking of the construction of whiteness in opposition of blackness in romance literature like King of Tars, The Sultan of Babylon, The History of the Holy Rood Tree, etc.
Wow. It absolutely plays a central role. Because a lot of what happens with the romance, and I really, really wish someone would take this up, is to look at the genealogy of the romance, to look at the iterations that it goes through. It never disappears, it gets retold. It'll surface in prose, then it surfaces in epic poetry, if you think of Tasso and the Fairy Queen, and then it returns to prose. It surfaces to some degree in drama, and then it returns to prose by the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century, and it stays in prose. But that construction of whiteness and as being whiteness linked to fair, so that you don't even have to use white. You could say fair, and immediately it's opposition. These romances played an incredible part in that. But it's also the gendering of that fairness, because on some level, it didn't matter whether the hero was constructed as fair. It was absolutely important for the heroine to be constructed as fair, which sets into motion an ideology of beauty that we're still grappling with, that defines contemporary romance, that we are starting to see people push again. No longer the blue-eyed, blonde-haired, whatever, hero or heroine. No longer the light brown hair, blue-eyed heroine or whatever. There's no longer this emphasis on the fair skins, no longer the emphasis on the blush. There are people who look like me, look like Yasmine, look like you in contemporary romances. That's a fundamental shift and a disruption of, honestly, the ideology of beauty linked to whiteness, linked to fairness, linked to a European idealization of bodies that carried through romance or from the Middle Ages, from the pre-modern. So absolutely, I hope I answered the question.
We have a couple more questions. Does Hassan al-Wazan, aka Leo Africanus, make an appearance in Elizabethan Mischief series, in the series as a whole? He returns to Tunis 9 years after his kidnapping and conversion. So
Marine,
I knew you would know who it was.
it shows up on here.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if you were looking.
No, maybe I could do that. I mean, you know, there's already a book of, ooh, I could do that. I think I will. Okay, thanks, Marine. You got it. I'm not sure which one. No.
All right. We have a commitment from Margo
Oh, I think I know
that
how to
Hassan
squeeze that
al-Wazan
one
is going to be in the
in.
series.
I think I know how to squeeze that one in. Ooh, yes. Okay.
I love also watching like the wheels turn as you're like, how can I make this happen?
Well, the next one's going to be set in a brothel, and I'm not sure he would show up in a brothel, but in London. But I could arrange a few things. I could begin in Morocco. I could do that. All right, I'll figure it out. It's a
All
challenge.
right. How does serialization play into the shift in both readership and the authorship of romance in the 18th century and onwards?
Wow. You know, honestly, I think, and you can thank the 18th century scholar who trained me, that I am relatively familiar with 18th century literature and the novel, again, a long time ago. But one of the things that I think serialization did was not just to foster a readership, but to make literary text accessible in a way that was much more egalitarian than prior to the idea of serializing works. And novels, I think, lend themselves to it because they're kind of chapter form. So you could write a chapter or two, you know. It's one of the things I liked about Dickens, even though I'm not too crazy about Dickens, but just, you know, cranking those little penny novels out so that you could collect them. And then if you had the money, you could go and have them bound, but at least you had them. I think it's also that when romance finally decided to return to the prose form, it made it easier to construct a readership for the genre of romance. Because, I mean, Fairy Queen, 12 books. Imagine if it had been written as a novel, that would have been 112 chapters, probably, given Spencer. But the format, the sense of exclusionary language, of using information to exclude a reader, you know, to construct a class of readers. And I think serialization basically demolished that idea. Even though I'm going to be honest, no, I'm not going to be honest. I'm going to be frank. I always love that word, especially since my brother's name was Frank. I think one of the reasons why there's this big thing on literature versus genre fiction is that can probably be attributed to the serialization, the kind of, literature belongs to everyone. So whoever writes it, we call that a literary text. If not, what is it? So I honestly think that without serialization, we would still have an elitist form of romance that was very exclusionary, very male-centric, and probably deeply patriarchal, to the point that contemporary romance as it exists now probably wouldn't have come into play. So I think we can thank the process of serialization. I think we can thank publishers, pirates, rogue printers, all those wonderful people in the 17th century who managed to throw together a printing press and say, whoop, there it is. And copyright law, of course, changed that all, but I think we could do that. So we have, 3 minutes? I need to flash. I need to flash. Okay. Sorry, I just need to get rid of my background because you won't see this. So you get to see my awful room. It's called The Self-Same Metal, Brittany N. Williams. You need to buy this when it comes out in April. It's Shakespearean. It's set in the first couple of years of James's reign. It deals with the King's Men. It is about Black community in London. It's about a Black woman. It's about Black family. It's about Black people. Okay? We are going to change your perception of the past, book by book.
Oh, I love it. Yes, thank you so much. That was fabulous. I'm going to thank you again, Dr. Hendricks, for this wonderful conversation. It was such a blast, and I always enjoy fangirling with you at any opportunity. I'm going to turn things back over to Becky Fall.
Hello.
Becky.
Sorry.
Hello, Becky. Becky and guest.
I failed to unmute myself because I'm dealing with this animal who's been crawling all over me. Yeah, sorry. I want to thank you both so much. This is fascinating. This is wonderful. Really, really interesting. Thank you for your generosity of your time and energy. To our audience, if anyone would like to learn more from both Yasmine and Margot, you can check out an interview that they did in the Sundial from ACMRS, which I've just linked to in the chat. As well, we will be posting a recording of this session on our Center for Renaissance Studies YouTube page, which I'm also linking to here in the chat, where we have past sessions from this series. And thanks again. This is wonderful. You really got my wheels turning, and I appreciate your time. I'm going to go read some romance.
Okay, can I make one suggestion to all of the academics who work in pre-1700 literatures? Can we please bring the romance back into fashion? The romance, those little epic ones, because they are a hoot to teach, and you'll be surprised at how that students will love them. So can we bring those back into play? Because I miss them. I miss reading about them.
You've got my vote too.
Thank you so much for having me. I totally appreciate you. I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both. This was brilliant. And I'm going to stop recording now.